Welcome to After Office Hours, the show where we interview Hillsdale faculty about their areas of expertise. Today on the show we have Dr. Tom Connor to talk about World War I. Dr. Connor, it's great to have you. So we're coming up to the 100th anniversary of American entry into World War I, and it's typically considered one of the more neglected wars throughout American history. There's, for instance, not a national memorial. Would you just talk for a minute about what caused the First World War in 1914?
Well, perhaps one of the reasons why Americans tend to neglect the history of the First World War is because the war originated completely in Europe. The United States had nothing to do with the outbreak of the First World War, and for as long as President Wilson could manage this position, Americans believed that they didn't have a stake in the war either. We were neutral for almost 3 years before we entered. So I think that's one of the reasons why that war, as opposed to the Second World War, which, well, President Roosevelt's policies were more actively engaged in, the period of origin of that war. And of course, the Pearl Harbor attack brought the war home immediately to Americans. But I think another reason why the First World War is relatively neglected, certainly when compared with what Americans know about the Second World War, is the outcome of the First World War was very murky. President Wilson made a series of promises, commitments upon entry that the war would make the world safe for democracy, and that we entered in a spirit almost of crusaders in 1917. But 2 years later, the peace was negotiated. Wilson had to make a number of compromises, and we all know that the peace didn't hold. There was a bitter debate in the United States in the aftermath of the First World War about it ratifying the Treaty of Versailles, about whether we were going to enter the League of Nations. Wilson lost on both those counts, and America kind of reverted to its historically isolationist position in the 20s and 30s, only to have a second war come anyway. So there was a lot of disillusionment in the aftermath of the First World War. Not that Americans weren't disappointed with the way the Second World War ended too, but I think there was a lot more clarity in terms of why we were fighting in World War II and what we achieved. The Cold War ensued upon the end of World War II, but at least we had defeated our principal enemies, and we had defeated them in World War II in such a way as they knew it. I mean, Germany and Japan have not threatened the world order since 1945, whereas at the end of World War I, Germany came back within 20 years and posed a serious threat. So I think the memories of the First World War are neither as clear or conclusive as certainly was the case in the Second World War. And of course, all the veterans of the First World War have been gone now for some time, so we don't have that connection. It's a much more remote event.
Earlier in your response, you mentioned that the war sort of started away from American hands. How did the powder keg of Europe sort of light up?
Well, yeah, I mean, the most famous single event that most people associate with the outbreak of World War I is the assassination of the Archduke, the Austrian Archduke, Franz Ferdinand, and his wife in Sarajevo. And we now know that, and it was suspected at the time too, particularly in European circles, but we now know that was an act of state-sponsored terrorism. That's one of the ways I think that when I teach the outbreak of the First World War, it's one of the things I say to try to get students to relate. I mean, we know what state-sponsored terrorism is now, and the idea that a single event like that could set off a trail toward the ultimate explosion of the powder keg, I think is a kind of lasting warning that wars can happen. They can come out of tense environments. They can come out of relatively relaxed environment. The mood in Europe in the summer of 1914 was pretty relaxed, actually. Although these long rivalries had been playing out, and there'd been an arms race in Europe for 30 or 40 years, all kind of stemming from the appearance of a unified German empire that the rest of the European powers had to find a way to digest, and ultimately they didn't really before it came to a war. But it was great power rivalries. It was the fact that there was a general failure, I'd say, of leadership in response to the provocation of the assassination of the Archduke. Nobody was really willing to take a step that might head off the drift toward war before it actually exploded. And I think almost subconsciously, most Europeans had been expecting for decades that there was going to be a war, there was going to be a reckoning, that the whole question of, well, who deserved to be on top of the world balance, all that was ultimately going to be resolved on the field of battle, such that when a crisis developed in 1914, nobody was either smart enough or courageous enough or even just willing enough to try to stop it. So they drifted into it. They did not get the kind of war they thought they were going to get. More than 4 years of just murderous violence. But it happened, and it wasn't altogether accidental, but certainly the forecast of the kind of war that was going to be did not pan out. So,
What was that original forecast of what the war was going to look like, and how was the reality different?
well, I think most people, not all, there were some very prescient minds who saw that once the dogs of war were unleashed, that it was not going to be over in 6 weeks or 8 weeks. But I think the general sense was that once the war broke out, it would be decided relatively quickly, and then the power balance would be readjusted, and then people would get on about their business. But that's not obviously what happened. The kind of stalemate that developed in the Western Front, where Germany was fighting France and Britain and tiny little Belgium. But that kind of war was not generally foreseen, although there had been a couple of wars prior to World War I, like the American Civil War. I mean, in the final campaigning in Virginia, the Siege of Richmond, for example. That was basically a stalemated contest with trenches and whatnot. There had been episodes in the Russo-Japanese War, which only preceded World War I by 10 years, that sort of foretold the kind of war that happened, but they had their minds focused on an entirely different kind of conflict, short and sweet, you might say, and there was nothing short and certainly nothing sweet about the kind of war that evolved.
What were conditions like in the trenches? I know that sometimes we hear about how horrible it was, but what do you think made conditions so terrible for the ordinary soldier?
Well, the fact that they were exposed to all manner of weather, all 4 seasons, but the area in France, the part of the Western Front where the war is actually going to be decided, namely the stretch from Verdun in the eastern part of France all the way up into Belgium. The weather there is notoriously wet, and when it rained in the trenches tended to fill up with water, and I mean the soldiers were exposed 24 hours a day to whatever the climate was. So it was bad enough for that reason. But of course, then you have the violence. I mean, the shelling never stopped. Yes, there were great battles that required the men to come out of their trenches and hurl themselves against the defensive positions that the other army had. And since those defensive positions were held by machine guns generally, and the men had to approach from the open territory of no man's land, there's going to be just a lot of outright killing as a result of that. But even when there wasn't an attack or when there wasn't a battle underway, the artillery pieces never stopped. And I think shelling actually killed more men, certainly on a day-to-day basis. When battles occurred, machine guns did more killing. But over the long run, I think certainly about as many soldiers died of artillery wounds as they did from bullets. And a fair number died from disease, too. So it just, hygiene was not good. Body parts were all over the place because it was very difficult with so much killing to actually recoup all the bodies and body parts. So rats fed off decaying flesh. They fed off whatever the soldiers threw out, their food, whatever. So you had all that. It was just a very, very nasty, almost unimaginably so, environment.
You said earlier that the United States shifted from sort of taking an isolationist position on the war to sort of crusader state view of the war. What happened in history that changed the perspective of the United States so much that they would be willing to fling millions of American soldiers into a situation so terrible?
Well, when the war began in Europe, President Wilson declared our neutrality, much as George Washington had declared American neutrality all the way back in the 1790s when Europe had erupted into more or less general war very early in our history. But for the Americans to declare neutrality did not mean that we were prepared to see what we took our rights to be compromised. And the basic right that Americans sought to assert in peacetime and in wartime was freedom of the seas, vis-a-vis European powers, was freedom of the seas. The British immediately declared a blockade of the waters approaching Germany in the second month of the war, third month of the war actually, October 1914. The Germans retaliated in February 1915 with their own declaration of a blockade of the waters approaching Britain and France. The Germans tried to enforce their blockade with submarines, which involved sinking ships, which involved killing, whereas the British enforced their blockade with the world's largest surface fleet. So Americans were losing property, but not necessarily losing their lives as a result of the British blockade, whereas the Germans, whenever they sank a ship with Americans on it, there was loss of life. So fast forward to 1917, the Germans announced, having used unrestricted submarine warfare, which involves sinking ships without warning of neutral stripe or belligerent stripe, whether they were civilian liners, the Lusitania, of course, sinking in May 1915, brought the United States close, I think, to declaring war on Germany, but at the end, because 128 Americans died, unlawfully, as President Wilson understood the laws of neutrality. But at the end of the day, he was not willing to make the Lusitania a cause, a casus belli, as the Romans would say. And the Germans backed off in the wake of the Lusitania sinking from their policy of unrestricted submarine warfare through 1916, basically to mollify the Americans. But in early 1917, the Germans went back to a policy of unrestricted submarine warfare because they were trying to starve the British into submission and win the war. The Germans were concerned about all the loss of life for 2.5 years of stalemated war on the Western Front. The British blockade's effect on Germany was telling, so they decided to play the unrestricted submarine warfare card again. American ships started being sunk after the 1st of February 1917, and it's just 2 months before President Wilson declares war, or he asks Congress to declare war. But there was the other matter of the Zimmerman telegram. The British unearthed evidence from intercepts of German wireless communication the effect that the Germans were trying to conspire with the Mexicans to get the Mexicans to make war on the United States, to complicate our decision-making in response to the return to unrestricted submarine warfare. The Germans wanted the Americans to understand, if the Mexicans had agreed to this alliance, that if the United States was going to go to war with Germany over submarine warfare, they were going to have a war on two fronts. Well, as it turns out, the Mexicans didn't take the bait of that German alliance, but the mere revelation that the Germans were conspiring with our neighbor to the south in a very clandestine, secretive way, that sort of pushed Wilson over the brink. He concluded that we could never have reliably friendly relations with a government like that. So.
How did ordinary Americans respond to our entry into World War I?
Well, I think there was great support for the idea. The declaration of war passed Congress with 50 votes against it in the House, but there were more than 350, I think, for it. And in the Senate, there were 6 senators who opposed it, 82 supported it. So Wilson had widespread support in Congress, and I think congressional opinion does tend to reflect, anyway, popular opinion more generally. On our campus, I'm anticipating a question I thought you might want to ask, but on the campus here, the response was immediate. The declaration of war was issued on April 6th, 1917. On April 12th, there was an editorial in the Collegian that was entitled, and I'm indebted to Arlen Gilbert's 2-volume history of Hillsdale College for this information. But there was an editorial in the Collegian, and it was entitled, "Are You Going to War?" They didn't have the picture of Uncle Sam, "I want you." They didn't quite go to that extent. But they were basically putting the question, now there were only 300 or 400 students at Hillsdale College then, about half male. And the editor was basically saying to the guys, principally, how are you going to respond to this? And by the spring of the following year, half the male population of Hillsdale was already in the Army. And I think Professor Gilbert said there were only about 12 or 15 males left on campus by 1918, after the war had had been going on for a while. And the Collegian editorial during the first week of what was for us the war also reminded people that back in 1861, when the Civil War had broken out, that Hillsdale guys had answered the call in disproportionately large numbers. And he was basically saying, all right, is it going to be the same way this time? And it was. By the time the war was over, I think Professor Gilbert has found there were more than 350 Hillsdale students. Now, that's not current students, but recent graduates as well as men and women from the current student body who were in some kind of service, and close to 125 were overseas. 6 Hillsdale guys were killed in the war, or died during the war. 3 were killed in action, 1 died at sea, and I think 2 died of pneumonia, which could have been spawned of the flu. But and there were a number of medals issued. 4 of our soldiers got French Croix de Guerre medals. So the college really responded, and I think it was generally a popular war. I mean, I think Americans bought Wilson's sales pitch, and I don't mean to demean it, but the way he presented the war did resonate, I think, and he was very effective in his war message to Congress at connecting what Americans would be fighting for in Europe to make the world safe for democracy with the principles with which Americans had always identified. He actually even came close to plagiarizing language from the Declaration of Independence in the conclusion of his war message. So I think it generally was popular. The disillusionment came afterwards.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Connor,
pleasure.
for being on.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
You can follow the After Office Hours on the Hillsdale Collegian Facebook page, our website, our YouTube channel, and our Twitter account.